Committee will come to order. Following our hearings on the state of the world, security environment, and the state of the military, today we begin to examine some of the specific security challenges facing the United States. This week, the topic is terrorism. In conjunction with the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, there will be a number of classified and unclassified events this week on that topic. The United States has been explicitly at war with terrorist organizations for close to 18 years. The threat to Americans and to American interests has certainly changed over the course of that time. Today, we all have hopes the Iraqi military will continue to drive ISIS out of Iraq and that a coalition can reduce its presence and ability to operate in Syria. But we should be under no illusion squeezing ISIS out of Iraq and Syria will push some of them into other parts of the world, such as Africa and Southeast Asia. Al-Qaeda has not gone away, despite its lower profile in the news, and in fact, some believe that it is rebuilding its capacity for attacking the West. And while terrorists have physically spread out to more geographic locations, some of them have also become quite adept at operating online as well, challenging our intelligence collection and our counterterrorism efforts. We are privileged today to have three experts to whom this committee has regularly turned for perspective and guidance over the years. They will help us step back from the headlines of the moment to assess the status of the terrorist threat, how it's evolving, and what kind of capability the United States must have to defend our people. Before turning to them, I'd yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I largely concur in your opening remarks. I think you can rank the threats in different ways, but I've always, felt that the number one threat was what is presented by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of the offshoots, because whatever challenges we may have with other countries in the world, this is the one group, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, et cetera, that wakes up every morning trying to kill as many Westerners as is humanly possible, and the only thing that is stopping them is our ability to stop them. It is not a lack of will. So trying to combat that ideology and combat those specific groups, I still feel is the number one security threat that we face in this country. And I think that the chairman outlined it fairly well. Since 9/11, we definitely had some initial success in going after Al-Qaeda, knocking out their leadership, going after their home bases, and disrupting their ability to plot and carry out attacks. So the good news is we've done a decent job of identifying specific people and specific groups that threaten us, and then weakening them by taking out their leadership and undermining their ability to plan against us. The bad news is the ideology has spread even further. And you have people picking up the banner of ISIS who may have never had anything to do with ISIS, but nonetheless they commit terrorist attacks that threaten our security here in the U.S. and amongst our Western allies. So the real big question is, how do we stop that metastasizing of this ideology that so threatens us? I believe that we have to continue to focus on the specific groups, the threats that they have made. I think both President Bush and President Obama prioritized that correctly, but how do we stop the spread of the ideology? That's where I feel like we've been going backwards over the course of the last 15 years. That regrettably, more and more people, typically people who have, issues of their own, not happy with their life, have mental instability, pick up the banner and commit attacks in the name of this ideology. So how we combat that, I think, is the most important question going forward. Certainly, we're also interested in the details of, as the chairman mentioned, is Al-Qaeda reconstituting itself? If so, where? What parts of the world present the greatest challenge? And also, I think very importantly, who are the partners that we should look to be working with or continue to be working with, who can help us with this in those parts of the world where this threat emanates from? And so I look forward to your testimony. I thank the chairman for the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. As I say, we appreciate each of the witnesses being here today. We have Professor Bruce Hoffman, Director, Center for Security Studies and Director of the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University. We have Mr. Brian Michael Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President at RAND Corporation. And we have Ambassador Michael Sheehan, who is currently Distinguished Chair, Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. Obviously, more extensive bios are in everybody's information. Thank you all for being here. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record, and we'd be delighted to hear any overviews and oral comments you'd like to make at this time. Professor Hoffman, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith, for the privilege of testifying before the committee this morning. While ISIS poses the most serious imminent terrorist threat today, al-Qaeda has been quietly rebuilding and marshaling its resources to reinvigorate its war against the United States. The result is that both groups have enmeshed the U.S. and the West in a debilitating war of attrition with all its deleterious consequences. ISIS, alas, is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Some 2 years before the 2015 Paris attacks, it built an external operations capability and network in Europe that mostly escaped notice. This unit appears to function independently of the group's waning military and territorial fortunes, and thereby ensures that ISIS will retain an effective international terrorist strike capability. Moreover, there is the further problem of at least some of the estimated 7,000 European foreign fighters returning home. They are only a fraction of the nearly 40,000 terrorists from more than 100 countries throughout the world who have trained in Syria and Iraq. And unlike the comparatively narrow geographical demographics of prior recruits, the current foreign fighter cadre includes hitherto unrepresented nationalities, such as hundreds of Latin Americans, along with citizens from Mali, Benin, and Bangladesh, among others. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda's presence in Syria should be regarded as just as dangerous and even more pernicious than that of ISIS. This is the product of al-Zawahiri's strategy of letting ISIS take all the heat and absorb all the blows from the coalition arrayed against it, while al-Qaeda quietly rebuilds its military strength and basks in its paradoxical new cachet as quote-unquote moderate extremists in contrast to the unconstrained ISIS. Anyone inclined to be taken in by this ruse would do well to heed the admonition of the American journalist who spent 2 years in Syria as a hostage of Jabhat al-Nusra. Theo Podnos relates how the Nusra Front higher-ups were inviting Westerners to the jihad in Syria, not so much because they needed more foot soldiers, they didn't, but because they want to teach the Westerners to take the struggle into every neighborhood and subway back home. Looking to the immediate future, ISIS's continuing setbacks and serial weakening arguably create the conditions where some reconciliation with al-Qaeda might yet be effected, whether voluntarily or through forced absorption. Regardless of how that might occur, any kind of reamalgamation or cooperation between the two would doubtless produce a significantly escalated global threat. A quarter of a century ago, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher described publicity as the oxygen upon which terrorism depended. Today, however, it is access to sanctuary and safe haven that sustains and nourishes terrorism. A depressing pattern has established itself whereby we continue to kill terrorist leaders while the organizations they lead nonetheless continue to seize territory. Indeed, according to the National Counterterrorism Center, a year before the U.S. launched the current campaign to defeat ISIS, the group had a presence in only 7 countries around the world. By 2015, that number had nearly doubled. And as recently as this past August, the NCTC reported that ISIS was, quote-unquote, fully operational in 18 countries. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda is also present in 3 times as many countries today as it was 8 years ago. Sanctuary, it should be noted, also permits more scope for terrorist research and development of various unconventional weapons, as al-Qaeda clearly demonstrated with its pre-9/11 efforts to acquire chemical, biological, radiological, and even nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. In sum, the U.S. is facing perhaps the most parlous international security environment since the period immediately following the September 11, 2001 attacks, with serious threats now emanating from not one but 2 terrorist movements. Our Salafi jihadi enemies have locked us into an enervating war of attrition, the preferred strategy of terrorists from time immemorial. They hope to exhaust us and to undermine national political will, corrode internal popular support, and demoralize us and our regional partners through a prolonged generally intensifying and increasingly diffuse campaign of terrorism and violence. Indeed, the three pillars upon which our counterterrorist strategy has been based, leadership attrition, training of local forces, and countering violent extremism, have thus far all failed to deliver a crushing blow to either ISIS or al-Qaeda. Decisively breaking this stasis and emerging from this war of attrition must now, therefore, be among the United States' highest counterterrorist priorities. The current threat environment posed by the emergence and spread of ISIS and the stubborn resilience and long-game approach of al-Qaeda makes a new strategy and new organizational and institutional behaviors necessary. The effectiveness of this strategy will be based on our capacity to think like a networked enemy in anticipation of how they may act in a variety of situations aided by different resources. This goal requires that the United States national security structure organize itself for maximum efficiency, information sharing, and the ability to function quickly and effectively under new operational definitions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jenkins?
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, thank you for again inviting me to address this important subject. While perhaps not an existential threat to the Republic, I would agree that jihadist terrorism is the most prominent and certainly the most persistent security challenge that we face. Terrorism has increased dramatically worldwide, although most recent terrorist incidents remain concentrated in the Middle East and adjacent regions of North Africa and West Asia. The Middle East is also the theater of most U.S. military engagements over the past 3 decades. Jihadists have established footholds throughout the region. Both al-Qaeda and ISIL have sent out missions to establish or acquire affiliates, often by attaching themselves to rebels fighting local governments. Now, I think it would be wrong to see this spread of jihadist flags as the advance of an occupying army. It is not centrally controlled. Loyalties remain fluid, and we'll see how much attraction ISIS or ISIL continues to have when it faces loss of territory in Syria and Iraq. But it complicates things by turning one war into many wars. The spillover from these contests creates a multi-leveled terrorist threat. First, strategic strikes from abroad. Second, returning foreign fighters. And third, homegrown terrorists inspired by jihadist ideology. Now, improved intelligence, greater international cooperation, and continuing military operations have made it more difficult, not impossible, to carry out large-scale operations like al-Qaeda's 9/11 attacks. ISIL itself clearly has global ambitions and has assisted some terrorist operations abroad, but it has not, at least not yet, attempted to replicate al-Qaeda's campaign. Instead of escalating vertically, today's jihadists have escalated horizontally by exploiting the internet and social media to inspire distant followers. Their manuals recommend soft targets and simple operations within the limited capabilities of these recruits. The trend is toward what we might call pure terrorism, that is, truly random attacks on people anywhere, often by a single individual using any available weapon. Now, the small numbers of these attacks suggest that it isn't easy to remotely motivate people to action. The internet reaches a vast audience, but absent physical connectivity, most online would-be warriors do nothing. Still, we have to keep in mind that as ISIL faces defeat on the ground, it could respond with more ambitious international operations. Foreign fighters pose another layer of the threat, more so in Europe than the United States. The fact is here, however, that as ISIL is squeezed territorially in Iraq and Syria, That won't end the fighting. It will go underground and continue the contest, but the foreign fighters cannot survive an underground struggle. They will scatter to other jihadist fronts. Some will return home determined to continue the jihad. The principal threat here comes from homegrown terrorists. Fortunately, they are few, despite constant exhortation from abroad. Since 9/11, approximately 150 individuals have been arrested or killed plotting or carrying out terrorist attacks here. The FBI and police have uncovered and thwarted more than 80% of these plots. That's a remarkable record. As a result, in the past 15 years, jihadist terrorists in the United States have been able to kill fewer than 100 people. Every death is tragic, but certainly it is a far smaller number than we were worried about in the immediate shadow of 9/11. But although fortunate here, we still have to address the source of the problem, as Professor Hoffman has pointed out. There are no easy solutions here. Attacking root causes while reducing ungoverned spaces requires major investments and will take years. We could relax the rules of engagement and increase the use of air power, but bombing errors, we see, can create backlash. Partnering with the Russians to destroy ISIL, in my view, comes at a high political cost and offers very little in return operationally. Large-scale interventions by U.S. combat forces are best avoided, and any such operations must be limited in scope and time. Instead of sending more troops in, can we simply withdraw, leaving local belligerents to sort things out? That has a great deal of appeal. It would get us out of a costly mess and enable the country to focus on rebuilding the American economy. But the U.S. has achieved a measure of success on several occasions, only to see things fall apart when it turned its attention to other fronts. Still, Americans are reluctant to accept that this is an open-ended contest. But whether and how the United States might end or substantially reduce its military role remains largely unexplored territory. Thank you.
Ambassador Sheehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. It's a pleasure to testify in front of you both today. By the way, now that I'm not in government, I'll be able to speak a little more frankly. I want to talk a little bit about the terrorist threat, evaluate some of our counterterrorism measures, and then make a few observations about future policies. First, let me start off by saying there's good news and bad news to this story, and it's important to understand the good news. The good news is that since 9/11, our nation has been very successful in denying al-Qaeda, ISIS, or any of their affiliates from conducting a strategic-level attack against our homeland in 15 years. The bad news is that over the last 6 years, the number of violent jihadis around the world has increased dramatically. In addition, there are a growing number of conflict zones across the Islamic world, from top to bottom, from right to left, from South Asia to the Levant and across all of Africa. These conflicts have provided opportunities for the expansion of al-Qaeda and ISIS from their traditional strongholds and have exacerbated the anger of homegrown terrorists in Europe and in the United States. During the past few years, sadly, 3 armies that we armed and trained to the teeth collapsed in front of lightly armed militia groups: Mali in 2012, Iraq in 2014, and Yemen in 2015, providing our enemies with tons of equipment, ammunition, and vehicles. Let me expand a little bit on the bad news. I skipped over some of the good news. There's a lot, but it's in my written testimony. Let me focus on the bad news. Since the Arab Spring, the Islamic world has been beset with these conflicts. Currently, there are 4 failed states in the Islamic world: Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. There are at least 5 other states with major areas of ungoverned space, including the Fatah in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, and Mali. In addition, there are several other states with conflicts brewing at varying degrees of violence and ungoverned space, such as southern Philippines, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and also in the Sinai region of Egypt. The roots of these conflicts are complex. Many go back decades. but all have been exacerbated by the Arab Spring and the involvement of radical jihadis. Each of these conflicts has its own unique characteristics, which, again, is in my written testimony. They're all very, very different, and AQ and ISIS adapt to each one of those to expand their influence and pour gasoline on the fire and extend their own strategic goals. Before recommending any new actions, let me quickly review what has worked for the past 15 years. It's very important to understand a lot of what we have done has worked. It's not luck that we haven't been reattacked since 9/11. It's not luck. It's a lot of hard work. I describe it in 4 layers of defense, starting the sanctuary areas, which I'll focus mostly on because this is the Armed Services Committee. But the second area is the area between the sanctuary areas and our border, where mostly that action is involved with intelligence sharing. The third layer of defense is our border, and that's very much related, those watch lists, to the intelligence sharing in the second layer defense. The fourth and final defensive area is our homeland, and that primarily is the work of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force and organizations like NYPD that I was proud to be a part of. Let me talk a little bit about the sanctuaries again and what we've done there and what has worked. In the sanctuary areas, we have pounded al-Qaeda's leadership in the Fatah, Yemen, and Somalia with lethal action from the skies and also from the land and sea. This model has now been expanded to ISIS targets in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Some pundits call these programs whack-a-mole, inferring that terrorists quickly rebound from these attacks. My experience in studying the behavior of these groups has been very different. In those regions where we conduct these operations, not only do we kill off the most experienced, talented, and dangerous terrorists, but those that come after them are principally concerned about staying alive. And they know that it's extremely dangerous for them to talk on a phone, send an email, meet with more than 2 or 3 people, travel in a car, set up a safe house, or a small training area. And those that do so have a very short life expectancy, and they all know it. And it's difficult to run an international terrorist organization when you're under such pressure and your primary concern is physical survival. But our most important instrument, in addition to these strikes, is the training, advice, and assistance of our military units in these regions, particularly by the U.S. Army Special Forces. As advisors, in most of our cases, our soldiers should not be involved with what's referred to as actions on the objective. That's the shooting part of it. They should be more advisors and allow the host country military forces take actions on the objective. Again, I go through more of that concept in my written remarks. Let me conclude by saying with 10 points on how we need to ramp up our policies in order to respond to this increasing threat and some of the problems we've had in the last few years. First of all, as Mr. Jenkins said, try not to invade countries. That doesn't always work out very well. But at the same time, we have this allergy to invading countries. And secondly, I say don't allow more of these collapsed armies to happen, Mali, Yemen, Iraq. It's not necessary. So my second point is if you do have to intervene, look at the French model in Mali, where they got in, crushed the rebellion, and got out, and they didn't own the problem. They still have small forces there putting pressure on AQIM, but they have not owned Mali, and they've got out after they achieved their objective. Thirdly, we should expand our train, advise, and assist programs across the danger areas that I discussed. Advisors should be able to move forward, but again, as I said, the actual shooting should go to the host country. Fourth, Afghanistan and Iraq are very, very important, but I caution about creeping troop increases in both countries. Thousands of advisors that are there in advice missions, when it becomes too big, it begins to look and smell like an occupation. And occupations create as many problems as they seek to solve. When I was a Special Forces advisor in El Salvador, in a compound, by the way, that was overrun 3 times in 7 years, there was never more than 2 or 3 Special Forces advisors per brigade. And for 6 months, I was there by myself. Sometimes less is more in this type of operation. Fifth, aviation is a game changer. Drones collect intelligence and target terrorist leadership. Attack helicopters, C-130s, A-10s are the ground pounder's best friend in a firefight. If you want to do more in these combat zones, I would expand aviation, not only U.S., but host countries to the extent that you can, and keep the footprint of ground forces to a minimum. Troop increases should be done in tens and hundreds. I'm skeptical about increases in the thousands. Sixth, keep your socio-political objectives humble and limited. These problems are very complex, and even if you solve them in a country like Tunisia, which is stable, has low rule of law, some economic development, they export on a per capita basis more jihadis than any other Arab country. So even where you have solve all the political social problems doesn't guarantee that you're going to eliminate the jihadis. Seventh, support our key allies in the regions that are in the front lines of this fight, particularly Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and others like Niger that are hosting our aircraft in Central Africa. They're not perfect partners, but they are our partners and need our support. 8, crank up the pressure on Iran. We should no longer accept Iranian transgressions against our soldiers and sailors. A swift and determined response should be conducted for future transgressions. Failure to do so risks escalation of these attacks from this rogue regime. 9th, preserve our troops. Their lives are pressure, and there are a growing number of requirements around the world. We've been fighting this war for the last 15 years. We're going to have to do it for the next 15 at least. At the same time, they're being asked to prepare for conflicts in Central Europe and all the way to East Asia. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we're at a long war against a determined enemy. The key to our success is going to be sustained pressure in a targeted fashion across all the 4 layers that I talked about. If there are weaknesses in any one of those layers, we become vulnerable. If we keep the pressure on all 4, we can prevent strategic attacks like we have for the 15 years and try to minimize the lone wolf attacks, while at the same time allowing our soldiers to prepare for the threats that loom on the horizon, threats that you, Mr. Chairman, are very much aware of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I guess I'm struck by the similarities. Each of you basically see or describe the threat as having evolved in a similar way, spread out more geographically, more groups, but fewer spectacular attacks, more kind of lower level attacks. I guess I'd like to just ask each of you, where do you see the threat going next? There are some people, for example, who argue that as ISIS gets squeezed in Iraq and Syria, the incentive for more spectacular attacks to show that they're still there, they're still viable, to be an attraction for their followers will grow, and that they will shift, basically, to more spectacular sorts of attacks. I think a couple of you touched on it. There are continuing concerns. We've seen the use of chemical weapons in the Iraq-Syria theater. There continue to be concerns that chemical, biological, or radiological weapons could get in their hands. So I'd just like to ask each of you briefly, where do you see this going next in terms of the threat? How will it evolve in your judgment? Professor Hoffman?
Well, I think you're quite correct that as ISIS is continually squeezed in order to maintain its relevance, burnish its credentials, it's going to have to strike. And I think over the past 2 or 3 years, it's built up capability in Europe to carry out, on the one hand, Paris-style or Istanbul-style attacks that result in mass casualties, but also to animate or to motivate individuals, such as the truck driver in Nice last July. For me, the big question is how long al-Qaeda will wait in the wings. I'm convinced, although this is just intuition and gut feeling, is that al-Qaeda will absorb ISIS at some point, that as ISIS is weakened on the battlefield, it will take on those fighters, whether voluntarily or some sort of a hostile takeover. Because basically, when you compare ISIS and al-Qaeda now, al-Qaeda is way ahead of ISIS in terms of leadership that has largely remained intact and also has been dispersed throughout the world, but particularly to the Levant, in cohesion, in ideology, and I would argue in support. The one advantage ISIS clearly has is this external operations capability, which is in part because Zawahiri has deliberately held back al-Qaeda. So al-Qaeda wants that external operations capability. As I said in my testimony, that would, I think, escalate this conflict onto a different level. And this is why al-Qaeda, I think, has been seeding Syria in particular with some of its most valued senior leadership, including Saif al-Adil, amongst others. In terms of your point about the chemical weapons, I mean, think of what the Tsarnaev brothers did in Boston with a pressure cooker bomber that they downloaded from the internet, or think of the considerable alarm that a truck driver caused in Nice. Even a chemical weapon, some unconventional attack or an attack using an unconventional weapon in a European city. And here I agree completely with my former boss and mentor, Brian, that the threat is much greater in Europe than it is in the United States. But an attack with an unconventional weapon like that, I think, would have profound rippling and second and third order effects that would catapult the fear level that these groups are able to impose to a much higher level. And the fact that ISIS has already regularly used chemical weapons, that there has been evidence in the past 3 years of al-Qaeda similarly developing sarin nerve gas, for example, that this is a potentiality we have to consider, and the psychological repercussions that would follow in its wake.
Mr. Jenkins?
I do think there will be pressure on ISIL to do something, particularly as it's squeezed in Iraq and Syria. That spectacular doesn't have to ascend up to the level of a 9/11. I mean, I agree with Bruce that if you look at the Paris attacks or the Nice attack, or even something that might be the equivalent of what we saw take place in Mumbai in 2008, or in Nairobi more recent than that, that is a number of shooters, suicide bombers, hostage situations that can basically paralyze a city. I would also not exclude, because it has been a continuing quest of AQAP, as well as a demonstrated capability of ISIL, and that is sabotage of aircraft has to be included. Given the state of the world and the apprehension that has already been created by 9/11 and by the continuing terrorist threat, it doesn't have to ascend to the level of a 9/11 to have this major psychological impact, which is what this is all about. I would also agree that the foreign fighters themselves, apart from central leadership, they're going to scatter. They either die in Syria and Iraq, or they scatter. Some of them went to Syria, I'm convinced, initially, not to fight and die in Syria, but to gain the contacts and training and experience necessary to bring the violent jihad back home. So as we make progress, and even evidence of that progress in Syria and Iraq, could see a burst of terrorist activity elsewhere. Europe is more vulnerable to that because of the proximity and the physical connectivity of a number of these fighters and people who stayed back home. The thing that gave power to the lethality to the Paris and Brussels attacks was the fact that foreign fighters were able to come back and hook up with people who did not go, but who provided an underground, a logistics infrastructure, weapons and so on, that could make them operate at a much more lethal level. Finally, completely separate from all of this in terms of the future, in terms of the trajectory of this ideology, this jihadist ideology is becoming a conveyor for individual discontents. That is for individuals who are unhappy with their lives, who are aggressive, who are suffering from issues of substance abuse, even mental illness. This ideology resonates with it, and we're increasingly seeing individuals that, if you ask me, are these crazy people or are these terrorists, my answer is yes. And that is going to be just a continuing phenomenon we're going to be dealing with.
Bester?
Mr. Chairman, sometimes in the U.S. We theorize about strategies and shifts of strategies by terrorists. I actually believe that they have never moved away from their intention to conduct massive attacks within the United States for both al-Qaeda, and I think ISIS would love to do it as well. It's part of their DNA and what they're all about. The reason they haven't done it, quite frankly, because they can't. So I believe that if they could tomorrow they would organize a complex and sophisticated attack against the United States. I remember when I was in New York City after 9/11, I used to give speeches around the city, and then people would ask me, why haven't they conducted another attack since 9/11? I said, frankly, well, if they could, they would tomorrow, but they can't. That drove people insane when I said that in 2003 and 2004, but it's a fact, it was the truth. A lot of people said, well, they've changed their strategy, they're waiting for the big one. The reason, they will conduct a big attack if they can tomorrow. And we have to keep pressure on them, as I said in my remarks, across all those layers, and that will prevent them from doing so. It's very difficult for them now to stroll 19 people into the U.S. and take flying lessons and conduct 4 simultaneous cellular planning operations, conduct attack. That's just impossible for them to do now, not only in the United States, but even in Europe, even though in Paris you had some dimensions of that. But again, after Paris, and what happened in Brussels, you're seeing a lot of roll-up of those cells, and it's going to become more difficult for them in Europe also to conduct simultaneous multi-cell attacks, which really become at the strategic level. So they've never lost the intention to do so. They would love to do it tomorrow, in my view. Either of these organizations, I agree with Bruce, they're probably going to morph together. I wrote in 2006 that the only way, and Brian talked about whether they represent an existential threat to the U.S. I said then that the only way they could is by creating a WMD, probably an improvised WMD. And I do believe they still have that intention, whether it be chemical, biological, radiological. I would suggest, and when I was in NYPD, what we tried to do about that was, number one, always look for the cell. Always look for the people that want to do that. And that's an offensive strategy of investigations and undercovers and informants to try to break up that cell before they have the capability to conduct a sophisticated attack like chemical, biological, or radiological. And then the second thing I would suggest is you try to protect the materials. When I was in New York City, we had 10 hospitals that had pathogens that were very dangerous. We've reduced that to just a few right now and improved the security around them. The radiological materials that you find in hospitals and engineering firms have to be protected. And so, in my view, to prevent a WMD, an improvised WMD attack, takes 2 lines of effort. One, go after the cells, prevent them from getting any sophistication. And second, make sure you got the materials protected, whether it's biological pathogens, radiological materials, or dangerous chemicals.
Thank you. Thank you all. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, before I start my questions, we do have 2 new members of our committee. We're still waiting for the third. I apologize. They were both here at the start, but now we only have one. But we have Tom O'Halloran, who has joined us from Arizona. He served 3 terms in the Arizona House of Representatives and 1 in the Arizona State Senate. Former Chicago homicide detective and a member of the Chicago Board of Trade and small business owner. Welcome. And from New York, we have Thomas Swazi, who served for 7 years as county executive of Nassau County, New York, and 4 terms as mayor of Glen Cove, New York. Welcome to the committee. We appreciate having you aboard. Thanks. The question I have, and following up a little bit on what Ambassador Sheehan said, I think you accurately described 2 of the things we've been most successful at. And I remember when people were complaining about the whack-a-mole strategy and thinking there are some moles that need to be whacked. And it also can be effective in exactly the way that you described, as it disrupts their ability to plan and attack. I also think the second key thing you said was that we need to work with partners. That making it a U.S.-led operation, making it any sort of U.S. invasion, in the Muslim world, that simply reinforces the message of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we need to do that. Going forward, the 2 things that I would like, gentlemen, well, you already addressed one. That's the issue that Mr. Jenkins raised. I don't know what we can do about, is that basically every disaffected person in the world is now clinging to this ideology as an excuse to do the kind of thing that they probably would have done anyway. So trying to track down those dangerous people when there isn't necessarily a direct causal link to ISIS or Al-Qaeda is going to be a law enforcement challenge across the Western world. But the piece of it that we haven't really talked about is the religious piece. And the fact that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and this is a very controversial subject, because, as I think General Petraeus said, our most important allies in combating groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Muslim friends. We need them on our side. These people are operating in their world. These people are hijacking their religion. They are the ones that are going to need to lead the fight. But I guess the biggest question is, well, one last ideological point. There are those, particularly in this current administration, who view Islam itself as illegitimate. That basically Islam is not a religion, they have said. It is an ideology of subjugation. And if you take that approach, basically looking at all Muslims across the world and saying that until you fundamentally change, we are going to view you all as a threat, that strikes me as a bad approach. But what I would like to ask is, what Muslim allies, well, I'm not going to like to ask, I'm just going to ask it. What Muslim allies are there that we should work with? And how do we combat Al-Qaeda and ISIS interpretation? I forget the gentleman who wrote the book, but some years ago, when the chairman and I were on the, what was then the Terrorism Subcommittee, we had the author of a book called The Al-Qaeda Reader come testify before us and basically say, you know, bin Laden's got an argument about his interpretation of the religion. Now, I don't agree with that. There's 1,000 different ways to interpret just about every religion out there. But who are our best messengers for this? How do we best combat that ISIS and these folks are merely taking Islam to its logical conclusion, a view that I totally disagree with. But who do we look to counter it? What's the best counter argument? And how can we persuade the current White House to not go down that we're at war with all Muslims route? Because I think that is quite literally a dead end. How would you wrap all of those religious issues together and give us a strategy? Whoever wants to take a crack at that is welcome. Don't all leap in.
We're all going to look at each other to see who's going to go down that path first. Look, first of all, let me address pieces of, you raised several issues, so let me try to disaggregate those and address a couple of them separately. With regard to local allies, I think we all agree here that this is key. This is not something that the United States can do without allies in the world, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, to do this. And these allies in almost every single case are going to be imperfect allies. And so that raises, to put this into an operational question, they're not going to necessarily live up to our standards of democracy, of social agendas, and so on. And while we stand for those things, we want to be careful that we don't set an unreasonable bar that prevents us from working with locals as imperfect as they are. And so that means, in some sense, we're going to be looking for a way we can work with every single Muslim state, Arab state that is willing to work with us on this. There's some obvious key ones, the Gulf states, to be sure. Americans have, especially in recent years, a lot of trouble with Saudi Arabia, with the Saudis, but in fact, they remain a key player, and we're going to be working with them. The Egyptians, again, in recent years, that's raised a number of problems. We're going to be working.
I'm sorry. We could go down the road of all these.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the religious aspect of this and
right.
how you think we should approach it.
Just to touch that one, I'm not sure we can effectively persuade people to alter their views about religion. And I'm not sure that is necessarily a productive path. Patrolling ideologies or religious interpretations of the Quran or any other religious book is not something that we can easily do. I guess I'm more in the realm of I don't care what they believe. What I care about is what they do. So they can believe all of these things that may create certain societal problems in various societies. My principal concern is operationalizing that into violent attacks. So just as we're in a court of law, I don't care what the motives behind a murder were or something else. I'm concerned with the action, and I'm going to go after this organization to ensure that these individuals do not have the physical capabilities to implement whatever is their vision for the world.
Thank you. Sure.
Let me jump straight to one of the issues that's related, Congressman Smith, and that's the issue of whether we should designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. First of all, when I was ambassador for Counterterrorism State Department, I was in charge of the designation process of an FTO. It's a legal process. After it goes from state and it goes to justice, it's a legal process, and a complicated one, and a specific one. Muslim Brotherhood is an ideology, and there are groups in various countries across the world. If you were to go about designating them, you would have to do it by organization, which is what we do already. To try to do a sweeping designation, I think, would be problematic. And before we were to do that, I would suggest that we talk to our key allies, like President Sisi in Egypt, and ask him what the implications would be to designating an ideology like that as a terrorist when about half of the country voted for Muslim Brotherhood in their elections a few years ago. I'm not sure that would help him. And so what we want to do is help our allies. I think that the notion of trying to broadly brush as the religion of Islam as a problem is not productive. As I mentioned in my testimony, the fact of the matter is that across the Islamic world, they are plagued with about 10 or 12 violent situations, wars, conflicts. Some are in Afghanistan, it's modernity against a Taliban-esque version, all the way to tribal issues in Africa and different types of problems that they have. And on top of those, you have basically a civil war between the Sunni and Shia sects being waged right now, which is sort of, you could look at it as an Arab-Persian struggle, or you could look at it as a Sunni-Shia struggle, but either way, that struggle is exacerbating the problems across the Islamic world. There's not a lot we can do about that, except try not to make it worse, and probably try to stand with our partners in the Gulf, in Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and then deal with two of the most problematic of our allies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which are at the root of the problem in many areas, historically, both of them, and fundamental to the solution. So we're just going to have to work with those two countries through these issues.
Mr. Hoffman, you can be very quick. I've taken too much time already.
Sure. Actually, even though since 1989 I've written about how religion has motivated and inspired and changed terrorism, I don't think it's about religion anymore. I think it has much more to do with a very simple message that was articulated 60 years ago by Frantz Fanon in Algeria. It's about the catharsis of violence, the self-satisfaction of violence against what is seen as an oppressive, subjugative system. It's really South against North, the undeveloped world or the developing world against the developed world. And this is why I think our counter-messaging has been failing, because we've been treating it as a theological problem and it's gone beyond it. That's what I think accounts for the lone wolves, as Brian and Mike have described, but also, too, for these 40,000 foreign fighters that have gravitated to the movement. I would agree completely with Mike that designating the Muslim Brotherhood would be counterproductive. This is exactly the strategy that terrorists want us to embrace. Terrorism fundamentally is a strategy of provocation, where you provoke your enemy to undertake actions that will burnish the terrorist credentials, that will support their propaganda. In my view, firstly, we should only designate groups that are terrorists, ones that are in fact terrorist groups. Secondly, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a cohesive entity. There are elements of it that are violent. We should be tough on those individuals and sanction those individuals. But at the same time, there's Muslim Brotherhoods represented in the Jordanian parliament, in Tunisia, and other places. We should be seeking to encourage those moderates and those who believe in democracy in the Brotherhood to embrace it more, not painting them with a broad brush.
Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. I yield back.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very grateful that Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is going to be the new chair of the Emerging Threats Subcommittee, and so she'll be taking a lead on the issues we're discussing today. Over the weekend, I visited the World Trade Center in New York. It's always going to be a tragic reminder to me of the attacks of 9/11, as the Islamic terrorists initiated the global war on terrorism. Sadly, the largest number of deaths in the war by the terrorists have been people of Islamic faith. And I agree with Mr. Hoffman that we must be ever vigilant to eliminate safe havens of terrorists wherever they are. I'm also grateful for the line of questioning by Ranking Member Smith. In a recent hearing from General David Petraeus to this committee, he emphasized on the importance of discrediting, quote, the ideology of Islamic extremism. Taking that statement in consideration, each of you, could you describe the importance of counter-propaganda efforts and what role it may play in discrediting the ideology of extremism? Mr. Hoffman.
I think discrediting the ideology of terrorism, of violence, firstly, I think you have to deprive them of their allure. And I think the allure isn't so much their religion. It's that they're able to seize and hold territory and to exercise sovereignty over populations. I mean, ISIS has emerged very suddenly as this mercurial threat precisely because of its military capabilities. So I think first and foremost, there has to be a military answer to taking down the state. Once that state is destroyed and once that allure is removed, then I think counter-propaganda messages and counter-messaging can be helpful. Until then, though, I would emphasize less the message and more the technological solutions of depriving the terrorists of the platforms that they use to communicate those messages. I think that's actually, at least in the current situation, would be preferable to the counter-messaging. The counter-messaging should prevent the resurgence of these groups, not attempt to address them right now.
Thank you.
I would agree. The counter-messaging is not the leading issue here. The leading issue is dealing with the actual threat that they pose, and that means going after the asylums. It means dismantling the organizations. In terms of counter-messaging, that's extremely difficult to do. We're trying to change people's world views. Tough to do. I think our most effective counter-messaging is in fact not messaging. It is what we stand for ourselves. That is, this country has always stood for certain values. These values have attracted people from around the world, admiration from around the world, and that is what we believe in. It is far more effective for us to project our own beliefs and to live by those beliefs than it is for me to try to discredit how someone else views God and their position in relationship to that God.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Ambassador?
Yes, Congressman, I actually believe we are winning the war of narratives, and we're winning by a huge margin. And you can see that every day as people stream out of the Middle East and risk mountains and seas to come to the West and to the USA when they could go to countries that have their own religious faith and language that are much closer. We are winning the narrative. Unfortunately, there's a small percentage of people that are attracted to this other nihilistic, violent narrative, and like my two predecessors, I think there's not a whole lot we're going to do about those. To the extent that we are involved in narratives, I believe that we could help our partners strengthen their alternative narrative. Instead of them trying to get slick talking points or glossy documents countering Quranic interpretations, I think what we could help our allies build up their narrative, what they stand for. And so that their young, moderate people are willing to pick up a gun to fight for what they believe in, not just the jihadis that are streaming in to pick up a gun. And I think they're going to have to fight it out at the grassroots level. And they do, Congressman, in the villages in Afghanistan or in Yemen, where the villagers there are opposed, or in Syria, opposed to the radical views of the Taliban or Salafist-type ideologies, and will pick up a gun and defend themselves. So I think that ideologically we're not doing too bad. The fact of the matter is there's a number of these people that we just got to get them. I don't think we're going to change their minds.
And Ambassador, Mr. Jenkins, thank you both in this regard. I have had the opportunity in visiting the Middle East to visit kingdoms like Bahrain, where they cite how grateful they are in 1895 that it was Americans who built their first hospital. And then we're all familiar with the American university system from Sofia, Bulgaria to Alexandria in Egypt, and obviously Beirut, that has been positive, and so I hope we keep citing that. Also, I'm really grateful when constituents express concern to me that people in their region want to live in the 14th century. I say, no, you need to visit the countries of the Persian Gulf. They all look like Hilton Head on steroids, and so it's much more positive. Mr. Hoffman, in your statement, you discussed al-Qaeda as rebuilding and marshaling its resources to reinvigorate the war against the American people and American families. Can you tell us about the long-term threat?
I think al-Qaeda has never changed, and it still sees itself in what it conceives as an existential struggle against the West and against the United States in particular. I think that it's taken advantage of our preoccupation with ISIS to rebuild its strength, particularly in South Asia, where, again, almost completely escaped notice when they created al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which was designed simultaneously to reinvigorate its presence in Afghanistan. And a year ago, October, one of the largest arms dumps since 9/11 was discovered in Afghanistan that al-Qaeda had been preparing to spread its ideology to India, which is, of course, the world's second largest Muslim population. And we already see its effectiveness in Bangladesh and in Burma. But I think elements like the Khorasan Group are an elite forward deployed special operations unit that is waiting for the proper time to take the struggle to the West and to the United States.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a reminder to the panel, we're now on a 5-minute rule total, questions and answers. So I'll try to be brief with questions and you try to be succinct with your answers. Appreciate that. Mr. Hoffman, you noted in your testimony talking about chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, that we should be looking out for that. What is new that is happening? We've been discussing this and acting on this since 2001. So what now in 2017 should we be thinking about that's different than what we have been doing consistently through the DOE and the DOD?
The threat, I think, is mostly in the realms where these groups can develop their own weapons or seize battlefield weapons and then deploy themselves. So certainly the frequency with which chemical weapons have been used by both sides in Syria, by groups like ISIS, but also by the Assad government, I think has loosened the restrictions, or at least the moral restrictions on using these types of weapons. The fact that—
Does that change what we need to do within the DOD or DOE to operationalize a response?
Well, at least from my perspective, since Iraq in 2003, there's been less and less attention paid on the terrorist threat using these weapons, and I think it's grown appreciably. So I think first and foremost, it's to review what's in place now and what is being done, and to be confident that it's designed to meet this burgeoning number of sanctuaries and safe havens, which gives more scope for the research and development of these weapons.
Mr. Sheehan, would you agree with that assessment?
Yes. I would just add that it's very difficult to develop these type of weapons. Even an organization like Om Shinrikyo, which had tremendous amount of scientists, unlimited money, et cetera, tried to do a chemical weapon attack in the subway system in Tokyo, killed 7 people. They could have done better with 2 9mm. Very, very difficult to do. I believe that the biggest threat, as I said in my remarks, would be I'm less concerned about them building a WMD overseas than I am about an individual within the United States who becomes radicalized, who has access to the materials, and I think that's where the focus should be.
Okay. Back to Mr. Hoffman. In your testimony, written testimony on page 9, you talk about, I think I counted 5 steps or 5 actions we ought to take, but one of those has to do with your suggestion that we have strict 90-day rotations division size regular military in some of these countries. It's called boots on the ground. That's what we call that. And what I have found here in 16 plus years in Congress is that strict 90-day rotations become unrestricted, unlimited rotations. So are you in fact advocating as part of a proposal for U.S. boots on the ground beyond special operations forces, which you also support?
I am, sir, and actually, Mike Sheehan also talked about this in the context of the French intervention in Mali. I think the problem is, we've tried invading countries, and that obviously doesn't work. I would argue for the past decade or so, we've tried the indirect approach, leadership attrition, building up host nation forces, counter-messaging. It's not working. The spread of ISIS, and I think the resilience of al-Qaeda is demonstrating that. So I was trying to identify the sweet spot in the middle where, if our enemies, as I believe, have enmeshed us in this war of attrition or this war of exhaustion where they're trying to provoke us to provoke our liberal societies to become more illiberal, to target these groups that will burnish their propaganda and their recruitment, I think it's important to try to break that cycle, to break that war of attrition. And in that sense, I think having taken down, for instance, Mosul sooner than 2 years would have dealt more of a blow to ISIS's allure and would have probably had a greater impact on dissuading the 40,000 plus foreign fighters that have gravitated to the caliphate from over 100 countries than the efforts we've undertaken thus far, which aren't working.
Okay. Mr. Jenkins, do you have a response to boots on the ground and how that plays into a change in operations and tactics?
You know, you have two former infantry officers here, and the right answer in infantry school is it depends on the situation and the terrain. And so I clearly we do want to avoid large-scale commitments of U.S. forces on the ground. It changes the dynamics. It changes the narrative. It is unproductive and should only be done in circumstances where it appears there are no other options. It's the right thing to do. And but here I would agree with both Professor Hoffman and Ambassador Sheehan. If we are going to go in with anything larger than special operations or small teams of advisors, then it has to be a precise mission, achievable within a limited amount of time, and you go in and you get out fast, whether that's 60 days, 90 days, or 97 days. That will depend on the nature of the mission.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Sheehan, I want to go to the points that you brought up. You listed the 10 points that you believe that we need to continue in order to defeat through counter-terrorist mechanisms these terrorist organizations' effort. And it sounds like much of that are existing policies. You're only wanting to make sure that we intensify and maintain the rigor and vigor of effort in those areas. I guess you'd call it more of a full court press. And I understand your vision within that is to deny the ability for these organizations to operate at the strategic level, and a secondary effect is to limit the number of lone wolf attacks and then be able to organize. What I noticed, though, is missing in what you lay out there is the endpoint at which you believe we will be able to demonstrate either some kind of success or some diminution of the ability for those groups to operate fewer terrorist attacks. Give me your perspective. Is this something that we're going to have to continue in the way you describe it and at the intensity that you describe it ad infinitum? Is it something that at some point we're going to achieve some level of success? Give me your perspective, too, on what the path is with this effort.
Thank you, sir, and for better articulating my own remarks. I appreciate that. And the basketball analogy, which I used on the full court press. I believe I never use the term defeat, because I think even if we could, it would require such a commitment of resources that's not commensurate with the level of the threat. We have a lot of big issues out here that this committee is dealing with. And the U.S. military, I just spent the last few weeks in the Pentagon talking to the Army about how they're trying to prepare for this wide range of threats from cyber to East Europe, East Asia, different types of irregular warfare. We can't expend all our national resources on this threat. I believe that what we're doing has worked. That's why I spent time on that in my remarks for the last 15 or 16 years. It has been working. We shouldn't demoralize ourselves. It's so easy to sit back and criticize everything. Around the world, things are falling apart. But here in the U.S., we have had success. I believe, particularly from my experience at NYPD, where I studied deeply these disaffected, the investigations that we had, hundreds of them within the metropolitan area and across the country, the FBI's cases, and knowing about the international. I don't think there's any way that we're going to stop these jihadis from attacking us over the next 20 to 40 years. It is impossible. So the notion of defeat, which somehow means we're going to eliminate this threat, in my view, is wishful thinking. So what I always talk about is preventing the strategic attack and minimizing the lone wolves. Over time, this nihilist ideology, which does have an appeal, the narrative works, but over time, it will wind up on the ash heap of history with the other isms of the 20th century, authoritarianism, Nazism, communism, and others. But it's going to take some time, and it's going to burn out from within itself, with its own contradictions. But that's going to take some time. As I say, this is at least a generational fight.
Very good. Thank you, Master Sheehan. Mr. Hoffman, in your testimony, you spoke about our counterterrorism actions as it relates to ISIS, saying, though, that there is a reemergence of al-Qaeda, and you talk about what we would need to do there with both air operations, ground operations, special operators on the ground, a division-level effort there on the ground to be able to do that. Give me your perspective on why you, first of all, believe that al-Qaeda is in this state of resurgence. And is it based on al-Qaeda's fighters and their vision, or is it based on their financial resources and their media networking? Give me your perspective about why you think al-Qaeda has reemerged and what you think their effectiveness is in that reemergence.
Well, I think the first reason I would argue that they've reemerged is that, I mean, they certainly have the global presence that hasn't contracted, that very quietly groups have gone over to ISIS, but they've cultivated new partners and new safe havens. Secondly, the appearance of al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, that I think they've pursued a dual geographic strategy. On the one hand, they sent some of their most senior leaders, Saif al-Adil, Muhsin al-Fadli, Haider Kirkan, fortunately, 2 of the 3 we have killed, in fact, which is certainly an important plus. But on the one hand, as I said earlier, to create the Khorasan group or to have this forward presence, and I think to groom and cultivate Jabhat al-Nusra, now Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, as their Middle Eastern operation. At the same time, which to me was astonishing, in January 2014, while everybody was looking at developments in Syria, for example, al-Qaeda announced the creation of al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, seeking to deepen its roots there and to use that, similarly, its presence in Pakistan as a launch pad to radicalize the region. So the movement of its top personnel to Syria, who have not really engaged in the fighting, that have been hanging back, suggests to me not that they've embraced a new approach to their ideology, that is peaceful coexistence to the West. In my view, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't suspect I am, is that they're girding their loins for the next battle. They're waiting again. Precisely what concerns me the most is that the terrorists, in a sense, are engaging in their strategy of provocation, and to some extent, it's succeeding. It's causing profound divisions in societies. It's leading to nativism and populism. This is the best propaganda that they can seize upon, and unfortunately, we're falling into the trap, and that's why my argument is, like all adversaries, guerrillas and terrorists, they seek to enmesh their stronger opponents in these prolonged wars of attrition and enervation. We have to break that. I don't think it is a generational fight, just as Ambassador Sheehan described, but we can't really survive this more than a few generations, so we have to start ending it now.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You back.
Mr. Kiramendi.
Thank you very much for your testimony and causing us to think seriously about how to proceed. There seems to be a common trend of thought through your all of your testimony, and I'd like you to expand on this, and that is that our actions cause a counter-reaction. And that counter-reaction might be to more advance the cause of radical jihadism. There's some recent examples, and I don't want to get too political here, one of which is the immigration ban, but there are others that have taken place, and particularly military actions. And I just want to be quite clear in my mind that we should always, do I understand you to tell us that we should always be mindful of the reaction that our actions will cause, and that we ought to avoid actions that would give the ISIS or Al-Qaeda a propaganda and recruiting and more radical attacks. Is that the case? And I just want to be quite clear so that we understand that reaction is going to happen. So let's just start. Mr. Sheehan, and we'd come on down from an ambassador if you would just hear from all of you on this.
Look, if this is not an existential fight, that is, if our survival is not at stake, obviously at this moment, that means we get to make choices about what we do. In making those choices, there are trade-offs. There are benefits that might be achieved, but there are costs that come with those making those choices. That's on our side. On the other side, we're dealing, as Professor Hoffman has underscored several times, we're dealing with an adversary that seeks to provoke us to doing counterproductive things. And even without that provocation, simply by our massive military power, by our size, we can end up doing things that will create backlashes. So that is the equation that we are always looking at. There are a lot of things we can do. One has to look at each one of those things and say, what is this going to get me? What cost am I going to pay, and what risks I am taking? If this were existential, we don't get to make that choice. But here, especially since this is a long fight, we have to be very, very careful about how we make those choices.
I have a feeling that I'm going to get the same answer from the remaining two of you quickly, and then we're out of time in 2 minutes. So I guess I just want to make my own comment here, and I'll let it go, is that it seems to me this is the principal point that, and the principal issue that we ought to be looking at as we develop policy and procedures as well as funding for the various activities that are going forward, and that we ought to be very mindful in every step we take that there will be a reaction, and that reaction might actually be negative to us. And this cost-benefit, I think that was about with the words you were using, Mr. Jenkins. And I'll let it go at that. And hopefully we will keep that in mind, both here within Congress as well as within the administration, and avoid those things that are going to be counterproductive. Thank you.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jenkins, you mentioned two countries in your opening paragraph. You mentioned Russia and China. And I wonder, while we don't share the values with those countries, or they don't share our values of human rights and personal freedoms, with regard to terrorism, don't we have a shared interest? Don't they see this issue of terrorism as a threat in their country as well?
In the broader sense, we do share an interest, more so probably with the Russians than with the Chinese, although the Chinese have tried to enlist us in their efforts against dealing with Muslim separatists in Western China. In the case of Russia, there are very real concerns about the threat of Muslims. I mean, in Russia, this goes back centuries in their history. Having said that, though, having a generalized sense of common concern, I was part of an effort in the late 1980s, a team that went to Moscow and conducted a series of meetings to see if, at that time, the Soviet Union could cooperate with the United States in combating terrorism. And getting beyond the general statements that we agree that we are both concerned about this, and really getting it down to sharing intelligence, to coordinating operations, that is difficult because here at the operational level, there are serious differences in how we view the world, serious differences in how we do things, and a significant level of mistrust. And it's just very difficult what you can achieve within that context.
All of you in your testimonies agree that the chaos in the countries in the Middle East, various countries, is what creates the ability for terrorists to not only exist, but to grow and to, in many cases, create their own economies. I just wonder if, when we see an area where we know that there are, say, 20 to 50 members of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, if we shouldn't be more aggressive in taking action to eliminate them when it's 20 or 50 before it's 200 or 500 and they have the ability to take a country or to take a city. Would you care to comment on that? How would you handle it?
I agree, Congressman. In fact, that situation happened in Yemen a couple of years back. We had narrowed our policy in Yemen as to striking only those that had an immediate direct threat to U.S. safety and security, which narrowed some of our targets. But a couple months later, or a few hundred Al-Qaeda guys doing a dance in a village in central Yemen, later Al-Qaeda took over cities and port cities in Yemen, and there was some more flexibility in going after broadening the aperture of those strikes. And I would certainly believe that there are conditions wherein that we need to pick up military action to prevent the massing of Al-Qaeda or ISIS forces when that happens, to prevent what could come forward.
If I could ask one final question. Obviously, the refugee situation that has been created with the war in Syria, a lot of humanitarian crimes there. It's creating a tremendous amount of pressure on people who do share our values and who do share our interests, countries like Jordan, countries like Israel. Is there a solution in Syria that does not include the United States working with the Russians?
I believe there's no solution in any country where there's conflict without an agreement with the major stakeholders that are willing to put people on the ground and fight over it. Unless you want to take it over and dominate every inch of the security equation in that country, if you're short of that interest, which I believe no one has the interest in doing that in Syria, means you have to sit at the table with those that are going to have that type of power. That means Russia, Iran, and all the other actors that have a stake in Syria have to be agreed with the solution, or you're going to continue fighting forever.
My time has expired, but I agree with you 100%. If you're going to if you have to walk through a pit of rattlesnakes, put on your snake chaps and let's get it over with. And the sooner we do it, the sooner some people will start to feel some relief in that part of the country. Thank you, gentlemen.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony this morning. Ambassador Sheehan, I wanted to go to your 10-point plan, and particularly the 5th point, which is a pretty forceful statement that if we are talking about using military force, as you just mentioned in the prior question, that it's a pretty strong statement that air power should be the vehicle, and also a pretty strong statement that we should be extremely frugal about the uses of ground forces. I'm reminded of Secretary Gates' departing statement that any future Secretary of Defense who recommends a large ground war to a president ought to have their head examined. And I was wondering if you could, again, just sort of embellish a little bit that bit of advice.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. The issue of air power doesn't solve everyone's problems. It's not a panacea. However, since about 1944, we have dominated the airs of the world in most of our combat situations, although in Vietnam it was tricky sometimes for some of our pilots fighting against those air defense and jets. Generally, we've controlled the sky. And when you can control the sky, it gives you an enormous advantage physically on the ground if the condition exists. When there's massing of the enemy, you can diminish that and then give your ground forces a much better chance. So I think that aviation gives us a technological advantage that can turn a situation, but never kid yourself that it's going to be the solution. So I believe that, for instance, in Afghanistan, when General Campbell was asking for more authority to use combat aviation to support the operations there, I think that was an important step forward in order to try to keep the Taliban at bay, because the Taliban are expanding areas. They are threatening the stability of that country. Yet I would be very, very careful about pouring too many troops in there. It's very expensive, it creates its own problems, and one way to try to push back the Taliban would be by having more liberal use of combat aviation to pound them. When I was in El Salvador in the early 80s, the FMLN was able to have columns of several hundred people, and when they had that capability, they threatened the stability of the whole country. By the time we brought in helicopters by the Salvadorans, and this is the problem in Afghanistan, we need an Afghan aviation solution there, and that's been a mess for 10 years. When they brought in the helicopters, it forced the guerrillas to dissipate they could never mass in more than a group of 10, and that was so debilitating to them that it was very difficult for them to strategically threaten the government anymore because of that ability from the air. It didn't eliminate them. Not in any case. That has to be done on the ground. But it can be used as a way to at least hold people off. When the AQAM was coming south and threatening Bamako, it was French attack helicopters that came from Burkina Faso and stopped them dead in their tracks. It was really just 2 French attack helicopters. One of the pilots was shot and wounded and died later. 2 helicopters stopped that entire column. And then they pushed them back across the river and scattered up in the north. And so the judicious use of air power can turn a situation. But again, it's certainly not going to answer all of your problems, but can be a major force multiplier.
Thank you. Yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question this morning deals with the increased use of online propaganda and social media by terrorist organizations, whether we're talking about formal magazines like Dubuque or Inspire, published by Al-Qaeda and ISIL, which have millions of readers across the globe. How do we effectively counter this propaganda? Do you believe we have a strategy to counter this propaganda? What have we gotten right, and what do we need to do better? I'll start with Mr. Hoffman.
I think we've had a strategy, but it's almost like the Dutch boy trying to put his fingers in the dike that's burgeoning in on him. They're communicating on multiple levels. It's not just theological. It's, as I described earlier, this appeal to a very classic Frantz Fanon, wretched of the earth ideology that glorifies violence, that sees violence as a catharsis. But actually, I have to say, I don't think Dubuque and Inspire are the main problems. I mean, those appeal to the peripheral, the hangers-on, like the Tsarnaev brothers, who tragically are capable of killing handfuls of people. What worries me is that groups like ISIS in particular, Al-Qaeda as well, are using the dark web. They're using highly secure apps like Tor, for instance, to get into the dark app. That's where all of their activity that's the most consequential, that is radicalizing individuals that best suit their skill sets, not just the hangers-on, the losers, the malcontents who are attracted to their kind of violence, but people that have skills in the computational sciences, that are engineers. It's through the dark web, and that's, I think, the dimension of the struggle that is really gathering momentum now. And we're just coming to grips with understanding the Dubuques and Inspire, and they've already moved on. And this was demonstrated over the past few years, where social apps like, Twitter and that type of thing, I'm not sure about really the impact that has. It's more the encrypted communications, from WhatsApp or Telegram that is facilitating both their recruitment and their terrorist operations, or at least the most consequential forms of recruitment and the most serious types of terrorist operations.
Mr. Jenkins?
The issue here is not, I would agree with Professor Hoffman, the issue here is not the propaganda and that comes along with how to dismantle and clean an AK-47 in one of these magazines. That's the problem. That's going to take place. In terms of much of the open web communications and social media communications, that has given them some advantages, but it's given our intelligence and law enforcement operations also a great deal of insights and ability to identify people and open investigations. A lot of the success we've had in uncovering plots has been because people have been communicating on the internet. From the standpoint of the greatest danger operationally, I'd agree with Professor Hoffman. It is skilled people communicating in a clandestine environment, and being able to do that. That is a great concern. And from the standpoint of crime other than terrorism as well as in terrorism, that is going to be a future battlefield.
And Ambassador Sheehan, I'm going to ask a follow-up to you. Given your time as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, what role does the Department of Defense play in this area of countering propaganda, and what more does the State Department need to be doing? And is the Global Engagement Center the most appropriate place to deal with this issue?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and congratulations on a new chairmanship. That's a great committee, by the way. Look, I have to admit, I'm a skeptic on these efforts for counter-messaging. We've been at this for 20 years. There have been volumes that are stacked up in all the think tanks and universities around the town. It's not a new thing. We have a big effort at State Department run by one of my predecessors at Solik. Yes, that's important, but I think the effort has to be in helping the host nations deal with their problems, as I mentioned before. Inspire is a problematic magazine that you brought out, and as Mr. Jenkins said, they do assembly, disassembly. They encourage people to attack, and once in a while they'll put a bomb type instruction on there, which you can get other places on the internet. So I think that, yes, we need to do this at the State Department and DOD. In my office, Solik, I had a small office that was also engaged in that, but I find that I think the most important thing that we can do in terms of counter-messaging is help give political support to our key allies in the region. That, I think, is more important to help them establish some legitimacy within their countries and try to roll back the movements that are festering within their country. If we could focus on helping them rather than trying to come up with some snazzy talking points, I think our effort will be better spent.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask, and anyone on the panel can answer this, what lessons can be drawn from the merger of ISIL and Boko Haram in sub-Saharan Africa and applied to the potential merger of ISIL and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula? And I wanted you to kind of expand on what you touched on, which one of you touched on a little bit earlier about what do these terrorist organization mergers mean for U.S. counter-terrorist strategy moving forward?
Let me just say briefly, I'd be a little bit cautious about the use of the term merger, because we're not really talking about mergers here. We're talking about affiliations, which can take place on multiple levels. There are shared concerns. There is, to a certain degree, in a broader sense, a shared sense of ideology. But these, on the receiving end of these, or let's say on the Boko Haram side and the other local sides, being a part of either an Al-Qaeda network or an ISIL network provides prestige. It elevates you among your local rivals. It may bring some modest amount of resources, so it has some advantages in terms of affiliation. It makes you more important than you are. On the other side, it gives the advantage of you don't control this entity yet, but you may be able to influence it. It gives you a new base of operations. It gives you access to potential recruits down the road. And left alone over time, you may be able to increase that degree of management and control over these things. But they're at all different levels. They complicate things for our side, but they have these narrow advantages. I still think that in many of these cases, we can look at the local groups who are attracted to this and make progress with them, both a combination of pressure and, in some cases, there may be some incentives, and attempt them to peel them away from these parent organizations. But they're not really mergers. Each side sees a tactical advantage in these connections.
Right now, I would say the biggest danger is that these alliances or marriages of convenience or affiliations with one another are played out in ISIS's strategy. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has already said to would-be foreign fighters, if you can't come to the caliphate any longer, if you can't come to Syria or Iraq, go to our vilayets, go to our provinces, our branches. So it becomes a escape valve, a sanctuary, an alternative venue to re-engage the battle. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think all terrorist groups are like the archetypal shark in the water. They have to constantly move forward to survive, and in that sense, they become opportunists. And smaller groups seek to hitch their stars to the fortunes of what they see are rising stars, and this is a constant process. And in that case, usually when a smaller group does affiliate or associate itself with a larger group, it brings in more recruits. It gives them greater access to expertise, which enhances their own violent capabilities, and it enables them to engage in the stock and trade of terrorists, which is even higher levels of violence, such as we've seen in Nigeria from Boko Haram, where even the most egregious successes of the past are now surpassed by this new association, by this new support, by the new expertise and new recruits they're able to attract.
In all of sub-Saharan Africa, which of the newly emergent terrorist organizations do you think pose the greatest threat to the U.S. based on scope and influence?
I'm going to give a counterintuitive answer and say al-Shabaab in Somalia. And the reason I say that is sort of the dominant paradigm of counterterrorism for the past decade plus has been that we've done a good job of hardening aviation security against terrorist threats. But last February in Mogadishu, al-Shabaab operatives affiliated with al-Qaeda, exactly underscoring my point about this exchange of technology and expertise, were able to smuggle a bomb inside a computer laptop and detonate it. Fortunately, it was not at cruising altitude, so the plane, there wasn't an in-flight tragedy, but nonetheless, admittedly, the security in Mogadishu, I suspect, is not as good as at other airports, but nonetheless, I think that was an important incident for several reasons. Firstly, it showed these groups, and al-Qaeda in particular, still has an interest in targeting commercial aviation. Secondly, that their ongoing efforts to effectively develop the technology to do so proceeds. And thirdly, that they're willing to use affiliates or associates in far-flung places to be their, potentially to be their foot soldiers in a new campaign against commercial aviation.
If I could add, Congressman, I agree with Professor Hoffman that currently, right now, al-Shabaab would be the biggest threat. Although over the horizon, I'd take a very close look at the North African groups in Libya. And a lot of those folks are Algerians that are veterans of some brutal wars over there. These are some really violent and skilled terrorists. So I think that we have to keep a very close eye on Libya and the spillover from Algeria, that they're still operating in parts of Algeria, and then south of Libya into Niger and over to Mali, as well as through the region. Those are some tough geography there, and there's some really some tough customers in that vicinity that could pose a big problem in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your insights. Ambassador Sheehan, I appreciate your thoughts on the asymmetrical advantage we have with air power as an airman myself. And I agree, we've got to take advantage of where we have those asymmetries. And as we're looking at that, all of you have mentioned this is a long-term fight. How does that translate to your thoughts on force structure? This committee has pushed back pretty strongly on keeping the A-10 flying for its unique capabilities. It's kicking butt right now over in this fight against ISIS, setting records of munitions expended against the enemy. We need fifth-generation fighters, but if we're asking the fifth-generation fighter to do all of what we need for air superiority in places of denied access, plus all of this on the other end of the intensity of conflict, does that make sense? You don't need a Ferrari to try and do what a pickup truck does. Maybe you need a Ferrari and a pickup truck. So what are your thoughts on force structure for this long-term fight?
Well, since I'm no longer in government, I can say if the Air Force wants to get rid of the A-10, then I think the Army should pick it up, in addition to the AC-130 gunship as well. The Army, of course, has its own aviation assets, helicopters, and those are fantastic. But I do desperately believe, as a former infantryman and special operator, that we need those fixed-wing assets that can hang up there. Now, drones can fill a lot of the gaps, but there's nothing like a 105 or the miniguns out of an AC-130 that changed the battlefield, or even a C-47 with a machine gun hanging out of the door can change the battlefield in a scenario in conflicts like this, where you're fighting irregulars that have AKs and technicals, Toyota trucks with machine guns in the back of it. So I believe that these aviation assets are a tremendous game changer. We should hopefully keep them within our inventory and also look to provide these type of assets to our partners. I think that the biggest failure, and I put myself in the box of failing, is our Afghan aviation program. It is a complete debacle. And we've gotten arguments here in the Congress and in Washington about whether we should provide Russian-made helicopters to them or Sikorskys, and it's just constipated the whole issue. No one is in charge of that program over there, and it's unfortunate the Afghan Air Force is so far behind the Army in the development over the last 15 years. And I think we need to look at that across the board, Congresswoman McSally, in terms of looking for security assistance for aviation for some of our partners, not the really expensive stuff. Old Hueys with M60 machine guns hanging out of the side of them, C-47s with miniguns. These are game changers, and these countries can use those type of systems. We might have to provide the maintenance for them and pilot training, but they can fly them and they can shoot out of the side of them.
Great, thanks, Ambassador Sheehan. I want to shift focus. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee, and one thing that we've been looking at is jihadists, this new phenomena of young women and girls becoming foreign fighters and becoming recruited to be radical. Their average age of the Western foreign fighters is 21 versus average age overall is 24. Of the Americans, 1 in 6 are women. And a very small number of them who have traveled get out versus about 30% of the men are able to get out. So it's a very different phenomena. We've been taking a deep dive on this in Homeland Security. They're not just victims. They are hardened jihadists recruiting others to come join the fight. Do you have any perspectives on that and how we specifically target the narrative and the approach to stop the propaganda to young women and girls? Any of you?
I take a quick shot at it.
Yeah, sure.
I do believe there is a small percentage of women that have become jihadis, and that's a problem. The bigger problem is that, and I hate to sound chauvinistic here or whatever, but generally speaking, 18 males between about 18 and 30, sex is on their mind. And one of the great recruitment vehicles of ISIS was, come to ISIS, we'll get you a wife and a girlfriend, if you pick up an AK and fight for us. It was a huge incentive for some of these folks. I think, and if you look at Boko Haram, that disgusting nihilist organization, a lot of the most egregious acts were in kidnapping women and forcing them into these raping relationships that they call wives. So the bigger problem, in my view, is the issue of sex as a motivator for these young jihadis to join these groups in order to get a wife, which they consider a wife, and we know is an absolute aberration. And I think that area needs a lot more work. It became obvious with Boko Haram, and it was a big news issue for about a week here in the United States, and it's kind of drifted away.
Great, thanks. I'm over my time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Hoffman, I really appreciate your point about one of the goals of terrorism being to provoke a response from the larger force or the larger country. And I think we can all think of ways in which we may have been provoked into expected and desired responses by terrorist organizations. Can you point out some ways in which we've confounded terrorist expectations, where we've done the thing that they didn't expect and where that's been successful, and how we might capitalize on that? And if you can't, can you suggest one?
I think where we've confounded terrorism expectations is especially Joint Special Operations Command. I think is the from my, I mean, I don't have the military credentials that my two colleagues do, but from my observations as an academician, the operation of the Joint Special Operations Command, especially in Iraq, but in the years since, the way that they've closed the operational loop in terms of getting timely intelligence through interrogators that are forward deployed on the battlefield to get that to the operators, the innovation that they've been able to, I mean, JSOC is almost unique in terms of the authorities that it has, the ability to fire people, for example. So they've been on the cutting edge, I think, precisely because they've been the most innovative and in terms of finding solutions and learning the lessons of the past, both what worked and what hadn't worked. That, to me, is, I think, been the most stellar weapon we've used against terrorists, amongst many, but in terms of a force structure, clearly.
Thanks. Question for Mr. Jenkins. We had, a few years ago, the leader of one of our allied countries in the Middle East say something to the effect of, you, the United States, shouldn't be leading this fight. We should. Muslim majority countries, Arab countries in this case. And we certainly want your support and your help, but we need to be the ones leading on the battlefield. And of course, everyone applauded. It's exactly what we wanted to hear. It never came to pass in any real way. What are your thoughts on the potential or reality of the United States creating a moral hazard in the region? Our allies know we will always be there, and there really are no conditions that I've seen us effectively set on our help and our ability to intervene militarily in that region. Is there any way to change that calculus for our allies or their perception of our willingness to intervene militarily?
Well, your observation that many of these high-flown statements, when we then leave them to their own devices, they sort of dissipate. However, at the same time, we've also had a tendency to stiff-arm some of our allies. I mean, they are not going to operate at our level of military, necessarily our. I don't mean this to sound like some sort of an imperialist statement, but they're not going to operate necessarily at the levels of the U.S. Armed Forces in terms of their capabilities. And I think sometimes our impatience to get the job done fast, our determination that we are going to do this right, has caused us to have our allies, in a sense, we push some of them aside needlessly, and that hasn't been helpful. I think there is a way in some cases where some of these offers have been made. We know if we just leave them completely alone, they won't do anything. So the challenge for us is, can we work with them to put together what they have stated they are willing to do without coming in and taking over management of the store? Americans are not good at doing that. We're pretty good at taking over management. And we've got to learn that we have to back off, and we're going to accept something less than necessarily our standards, but it's going to be more than adequate.
Yeah, and recognizing that we're in the armed services committee room right now and appropriately talking about military strategy, I can't help think about the fact that this is the fifth successive administration that's used military force in Iraq specifically, and in many other areas, that we have an AUMF 16 years in that we've used in 6 countries, including most recently Somalia, and that we've got to do a better job of defining our political goals and aims. And perhaps just an appeal to the chairman and the ranking member, there's a way to meet with the Foreign Affairs Committee as well on some of these issues to have a comprehensive whole-of-government conversation on this. So I yield back to the chairman.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for very compelling testimony and answers to the questions. Mr. Hoffman, I'll start with you, but I want input from the entire panel. When the Syrian conflict eventually ends, you're going to have all these fighters from Hezbollah, this evil terrorist organization, return to Lebanon. They will have increased skills, increased experience. But there's nobody left to fight in Syria. What happens to all those fighters in Lebanon, Mr. Hoffman?
We'll probably have the third Israel-Lebanon war would be, I think, one immediate effect. But this goes back to an earlier question. I think one of the most appealing reasons to cooperate with Russia in Syria is if it succeeds in isolating and marginalizing Iran more and weakening Hezbollah's military status and forward military position in the country. But this is going to be an enormous problem. I'd say the only sort of positive aspect to that Hezbollah fighters have been getting now, I think, acquiring greater expertise in urban warfare on a level that they lacked in the past, is that it's controversial amongst the Lebanese Shia, and that increasingly it's not the elite Hezbollah forces that are going, but more the equivalent of conscripts, in essence, young, poor Shia that have no other economic alternative, and that's eroding some Hezbollah support. But of course, Hezbollah also controls the government in Lebanon right now.
Right. Mr. Jenkins, your thoughts?
Hezbollah is a problem. It's particularly a problem, I agree with Professor Hoffman, for the Israelis as well as for us. But it's part of a larger problem in Syria, and that is there are lots of armed groups now in Syria, and they are not under the control of the central government, any central government. That is, there has been a power shift from a central military force to a group of militias, some militias controlled by Iran, some of them controlled by the Syrian government, some of them autonomous, in addition to the various rebel formations and Sunni formations and other formations. As a consequence, central government authority in any future Syria is going to be significantly diminished. And I think we are looking at, realistically, if a de facto partition of the country in which chunks of the country are going to be controlled by autonomous military formations not under the control of anybody. I don't think we're going to get, I know we have to cooperate with the Russians, I don't think we're going to get a national solution. I think we're in effect going to get a series of a partition country, and at most some local accommodations that hopefully lower the level of violence. But there is no government that can come in Damascus now that is going to be able to restore authority throughout the national territory of Syria.
Ambassador?
Congressman, this is a problem of enormous depth in the region, and as Mr. Jenkins said, there are different types of groups. The ones that worry me the most, though, are the ones that have been inspired, funded, trained, and even some cases led by the Iranian IRGC and the Quds Force. The Iranians have systematically, deliberately, have expanded the militiaization of the Levant and spreading back in Lebanon as well that threatens the security of the entire region. We are going to have big, big problems and increasing problems there over the years ahead, unless the Iranians are directly confronted on this issue. And there's where there may be potential to work with the Russians on this. I don't know. It's something I think that can be explored. I don't have great confidence in it, but it's something that we might want to explore if they are willing to put some pressure on the Iranians to calm down some of these activities which are inflaming the entire region.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for coming today. Professor Hoffman, you talk about the possibility of terrorist organizations developing and using weapons of mass destructions, WMDs. The proliferation of WMDs or materials to develop these weapons would be catastrophic and certainly a game changer. I believe funding of non-proliferation programs are integral to any counterterrorism strategy. To all our witnesses, how can we further proactively deter the spread of CBRNs, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons to terrorist organizations? Dr. Hoffman, if we could start with you.
Well, first and foremost, one of the most straightforward means is to ensure that all those countries that have these materials undertake the proper safeguards. I'm not entirely convinced that that's necessarily the case now with certain countries throughout the world in terms of safe-piling their stockpiles, particularly of strategic nuclear material. Secondly, I think it's paying close attention to the remedial measures that are going to be necessary should any of these attacks occur in an urban center. I don't think the likelihood is very high in the United States itself. I would put it higher in Europe just because there have been instances, for instance, in Turkey, where Al-Qaeda in particular has been operated laboratories to manufacture and produce sarin nerve gas, for example. So while I don't think this is necessarily an imminent threat, it's clearly on the minds of our adversaries. And I think dealing with the psychological consequences of such an attack. I mean, Ambassador Sheehan made the point with the Om Shinrikyo attack in Tokyo. Had they set fire on the subway, for example, and caused smoke inhalation, had they used handguns, they would have killed far more people than the sarin did. But nonetheless, the psychological impact of that use of an unconventional weapon back in the mid-1990s was extremely profound. And I would argue that those repercussions are going to be even greater now, and therefore not just preventing it from happening, but being able to very quickly remediate any sort of incident will go a long way to restoring public confidence and depriving the terrorists of the fear and alarm that they hope to generate from using an unconventional weapon that even might have a very modest casualty rate.
Thank you. Mr. Jenkins?
We are doing a number of things for obvious reasons that addresses nuclear. It's more difficult to address smaller scale chemical, biological, or radiological attacks, and for precisely the reasons that Professor Hoffman has pointed out, and that is that it is difficult for them to scale up to, an attack to really get into casualty levels that we're looking at the level of, say, 9/11 or an order of magnitude greater than that. But the nature of these weapons is such that even a small-scale attack is going to set off the alarms and reactions that are really going to cause us the difficulty. Can we stop them from producing very tiny quantities of anthrax or low-quality ricin or some of these things? Very hard to do. Certainly we should try to do. But there it is going to be a matter of really how fast can we respond effectively to these events that occur. With biological, fortunately, there's a way we can spend money and get a dual effect on this, and that is we have to look to our public health systems and our response systems and say whether this is a man-made event or not, what is our capacity for rapid response to save lives and above all, to show competence in these events rather than allow a small-scale event to become the one that propels the Republic into a panic.
Thank you. Ambassador Sheehan?
I think I would, Congressman, I divide the problem in two areas. One is weaponized WMD, nuclear, radiological, biological, or chemical, and improvised. And I think the there's two different approaches. For weaponized, which are generally done by a nation state, you might want to look at the Nunn-Lugar process where we tried to safeguard former Soviet Union nuclear weapons. I think that was a very successful program, obviously a big and expensive one. Maybe on a smaller level we can use those types of programs to make sure that weaponized systems by any country that has any of these types of systems are controlled. My biggest fear, quite frankly, nuclear is Pakistan. And we can get into that. I could spend hours wringing my hands about that fear. But on the improvised side, it's more difficult. There, you're looking at, I think the best way to defend against an improvised WMD is to crush those organizations so that they're unable to develop the type of sophistication to develop these type of weapons. If you allow them to sit in sanctuary and give them the time in order to develop these things, I think they will. But if you keep them on the run, if you keep the pressure on them, it becomes very, very difficult to do that. That's why for the last 15 years they haven't been able to, because there's enormous pressure on them. So I think the greatest fear I have is if we ever take our foot off the neck of some of these organizations to allow them, to give them the space to recruit the types of people and develop those type of weapons, we'll be in trouble. So my answer is keep the heat on them.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Professor Hoffman and Ambassador Sheehan, I would like to dig a little bit deeper on your comments regarding the Muslim Brotherhood. And Ambassador Sheehan, I take your point that the group is not a monolithic organization. There are, for example, two factions in Jordan, one closer to Hamas that I'm sure the king would like to see less of, the other that's less difficult to deal with. But you've both made the argument that we need to find a way of undermining the ideology. And this is a group that's ideology celebrates violence, it celebrates martyrdom. It has as its highest aspiration the establishment of a global Islamic caliphate. The end of its credo says, jihad is our way, death in the form of Allah is our highest aspiration. So if indeed the violent act is downstream from the ideology, how do we get at groups that are espousing the ideology short of designation? In other words, is there a smarter, more effective way of countering it that you would recommend if you're recommending against designation?
Again, I worry that this is, precisely one of those moves that plays exactly into our enemy's desires, that by painting with a broad brush the Muslim, I don't disagree with anything that you've described about the ideology, but again, I think the fact that it isn't a monolithic entity means that the repercussions of designating it as a terrorist group are going to be difficult to enforce, and I think the gains on our side aren't going to be tangible, whereas for our opponents, I think the gains will be significant. It will have furnished them with greater propaganda. It will, I think, I fear, have marginalized those members of the Muslim Brotherhoods that participate in parliamentary democracies that may have extreme views but don't share that same embrace of violence as a means to an end, and that we will succeed almost in creating the Muslim Brotherhood into more of a terrorist group than it is now. I mean, admittedly, it's a group that is very much in the gray area, but we should be focusing on the individuals who are advocating violence and not driving everyone else into their arms.
I think that I've said this before in this testimony. I'm very skeptical that American voices condemning the Muslim Brotherhood have much traction where it matters, and you wind up pissing off more people than turning away some from joining those violent groups. I just don't think it's a very productive enterprise. So in terms of designation, you have to define the group. And if you can define a group that calls itself the Muslim Brotherhood and it's a defined organization that's conducted terrorist attacks and killed or harmed American citizens, then we have an obligation to designate it as FTO. But the broad brush, it just doesn't work, first of all. And second of all, I don't think it's very productive. I do believe that the best thing that we can do in terms of supporting counter-narratives to the Muslim Brotherhood is to support the local nations that have to deal with that. They will have the better voice. They will understand the dynamics in their particular country and how to face that. So for President Sisi, who may perhaps, or King Abdullah that have these real problems with the Muslim Brotherhood. They have to figure out a way to deal with the political realities of their countries and try to focus on identifying the violent folks that are adherents to that and deal with them individually. And they have the best sense of how to deal with that. Back here in the U.S., our pronouncements about that I don't think are very productive.
And just a quick follow-up for Professor Hoffman, because I have a minute. So it seems like your concern would be that the designation would drive the sort of elements of the Brotherhood that are currently participating in the political process away from it. But wouldn't our experience in Egypt suggest that the Brotherhood, when allowed to fully participate in the political process, only uses it to expand power and act in authoritarian ways against our interests? I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
That's the problem, is that the Muslim Brotherhood isn't a monolith and doesn't have a centralized command. So yes, you're absolutely right in Egypt. But in Jordan, I think you can make another argument. And that's what concerns me. I think groups like Hamas that are part of the Muslim Brotherhood and that are clearly terrorist, that you be much more specific, I believe, than holistic.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I yield. Mr. Brown.
Am I on? I apologize. My first question I've asked in a full committee hearing. So this is a readiness question, and each of you seem to agree that there might not be an end to our fight against terrorism, but rather that the United States will continue to be involved in an ongoing effort, perhaps generational effort, to reduce the successful strategic feats of our continuing terrorist threat. If this is the case, could each of you comment on our military readiness from your vantage point and your experience, our sustained ability to reduce these terrorist threats? And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about the strengths and weaknesses of our personnel capabilities, both the strength, size, and the skill sets of the men and women in uniform, and also the level and engagement of U.S. and non-U.S. Human assets, intelligence assets abroad.
Let me comment quickly. First of all, I do think we've mentioned various figures here: 20 to 40 years, 2 generations. It is going to be very, very long, and the end is not clear. And as military operations are against terrorism become routinized, then traditional concepts of victory begin to fade away. Americans traditionally have looked at warfare as a finite undertaking with a clear beginning and clear end. We're not going to get that. This goes on indefinitely, and upping the investment of resources doesn't necessarily shorten the time horizon. It shortens our time horizon in terms of our ability to sustain it politically and in terms of cost. As a consequence, we have learned that if we try to do things with major investments, as we have in Afghanistan and Iraq, that this can have a major impact on our military readiness. I mean, we have imposed huge burdens on our military personnel. We have deferred decisions about acquisitions, about maintenance, about training, and as a consequence, I'm not the one to be able to give the precise answer to this as to how many of our brigades are really up to strength and combat ready to go at the moment, but I suspect that we have paid a heavy, heavy price in terms of our overall readiness to deal with other contingencies. So we are going to have to conceptually change our model to say we have to figure out a way to manage this, and I'm using the word manage to avoid the word win or victory, that's not definable yet, but to manage this for the long term in a way that we can sustain it in terms of readiness and in terms of political will, and not exhaust ourselves, which is precisely what our opponents are trying to make us do.
I agree completely with Mr. Jenkins. I just add that since we've reduced from the big efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, although we're increasing again, it's going to take us years to recoup, to get those brigades combat ready again. But we'll get there with the proper investments and if we pace ourselves. The biggest concern is going to be the Special Operations Forces, about 70,000 of those folks out there, men and women in all the services. They're going to be asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting in these fights. So we're going to have to, I don't think we can expand much beyond that. And I had a lot of conversations with Admiral McCraven about that and other leaders within the SOF community. It takes a long time to build these folks, 10 years to really get them ready. You can't just create them overnight. So I think that we have to be careful in husbanding those resources and carefully deciding where we're going to put them, because we have to spread them out. And I don't think we may be able to increase force structure a little bit, but I think in those areas it's very difficult. So it's a matter of setting priorities, and again, as Mr. Jenkins said, is designing a strategy that you can sustain for another 20 years.
Can I squeeze in a comment? We've been talking about terrorists and terrorism most of this hearing. What concerns me in terms of our military is what we're seeing with our adversaries is they're going beyond terrorism. We face hybrid adversaries now, whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, certainly Hezbollah, where these groups have conventional capabilities. They're able to seize territory. They're able, even in Al-Qaeda's case, something that they didn't want to do in the past, but they're able to now provide some form of governance, however rudimentary. They're able to take on even the established militaries of our local partners. And this is a trend line that concerns me, is that in the future, we're not going to be talking strictly about counterterrorism or counterinsurgency or even about countering conventional warfare. We're going to see adversaries that are non-state entities that get into this whole definitional question that Representative Gallagher raised about the Muslim Brotherhood, where they become very difficult to define even in this military context. And we're going to have a military, I would argue, but I have none of the credentials of my two colleagues, but that goes beyond the sort of the capabilities of the smaller special forces as they exist today, and that have to involve a different mix of forces perhaps than we've seen in the past, and a different model, and sort of the innovation and the different kind of thinking I talked about in my written testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for sharing your vast experience with the committee today. As a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, I can't help but to start there and consider our mission in Afghanistan first when discussing the global war on terror. Mr. Jenkins, in your testimony, you described the military success that has come from working with locals, including irregular forces. My experience in Afghanistan gives me grim hope that we'll find a long-term success in our Afghan partners given the significant headwinds that prevail there. Whether the corruption, antiquated systems, or misplaced loyalty, it's clear that our work in Afghanistan from an advise and assist mission perspective is far from over. Ambassador, you described in your testimony the war raging between the forces of modernity and the radical Taliban in the mountainous regions in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And since all three of you described the devastating terror attacks of 9/11, I'd like to explore with you how to prevent the AFPAC region from returning to a region where terrorists can move, organize, and plan devastating attacks on the West with relative ease. So, Ambassador, in your testimony, you expressed the need to expand our train, advise, and assist programs while also expressing caution about too many advisors looking like an occupying force. This sounds a lot to me like advocating for the status quo. Yet last week, General Nicholson testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee that we may need a few thousand more troops in the train, advise, and assist category. Do you agree with the General's assessment in that role?
Thank you, sir. I don't know about the exact numbers. I'm skeptical about bigger numbers. I think the real question is you have to go back and define what the task is. If he considers his task that he has to pacify vast regions of Afghanistan, then certainly he's going to need more soldiers to do that. The question is that really what the task is? Is it necessary to pacify all those regions? Is it necessary to spend the resources, have the body bags come back out to Andrews, fighting over territory that might not be existential to our national security? What we really need to do in Afghanistan is make sure that we have enough capability there to find and kill those terrorists that threaten our homeland. To do that is going to require a long-term commitment to Afghanistan to stabilize that country. But in terms of pacifying the whole country, I'm not sure that's worth the lives of more of our men and women that are dying and being maimed over there. And I don't want to get emotional about this, but this is what we're really talking about. So we have to be very focused on what we're doing. And so actually, by the way, this is a separate subject. I'm very skeptical about having field commanders come back to Washington and make pronouncements about troop levels. I've never met a field commander who didn't want more troops. You don't have Patton didn't come back to Washington and advocated he wanted more troops, gasoline, and bullets to move forward. Of course he did, but so did MacArthur in Asia. Those decisions are not made by the field commanders. They're made by people who have the broader perspective. Anything that he wants in Afghanistan, in a zero-sum world, which we have in the Pentagon, takes forces and funding away from other areas that directly threaten us from terms of terrorism and these other emerging threats that you've been dealing with in this and the other subcommittees. So there are costs and benefits, and Mr. Jenkins articulated beautifully. So I don't know whether General Nicholson should or should not get more forces. I think that we have to ask first, what are you trying to achieve here? And try to keep our objectives fairly narrow so that we don't exhaust ourselves.
So with that, aside from the train, advise, and assist mission, how should the international community combat issues in the AFPAC Fatah region with a limited troop presence on the ground?
Well, what's ironic is that the Fatah is the home of al-Qaeda Central, which traditionally has been our biggest strategic threat. They're the ones that blew up our embassies in Africa, or at least an African arm of that, blew up the Col in Yemen, an arm of al-Qaeda Central, and are the people that are responsible for 9/11. They reside in Pakistan. Some of them are floating back in Afghanistan, but it's difficult for them to operate in Afghanistan because we own the terrain around Afghanistan, not necessarily every mountainside, but we can reach out and touch them in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, in Western Pakistan, it's interesting, we haven't had soldiers there in over 10 years. Yet, we continue to diminish and degrade the capability of al-Qaeda Central to reach us strategically. I worry about this all the time, that without that presence there, and the Pakistani army isn't in there very often either. Once in a while they come rumbling through, but that's not really that effective. They're there in those mountainous regions, and what's interesting is we need Afghanistan almost as much as a base to attack the Fatah that we need Afghanistan itself. Afghanistan has no strategic importance in the United States. However, the importance is that al-Qaeda is there and blew up the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. We can't allow that to come back again. And they're in Western Pakistan. And for a variety of political reasons, we can't put troops on the ground there. So we've had to come up with a solution to diminish AQ in Pakistan without one soldier on the ground. So sometimes you have to come up with solutions with no troops on the ground. Other times, if you have the ability to send 100,000 there, it doesn't mean you should. It's a matter of finding the right solution commensurate with the threat.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Murphy.
Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. I represent a district in Central Florida that was significantly impacted by terrorism. In this last June, a gunman who swore allegiance to ISIL walked into the Pulse nightclub and killed and wounded over 100 people. This is the deadliest terrorist attack in the United States since September 11th. It's also the deadliest instance of violence against the LGBTQ community in our nation's history. Unfortunately, this event serves as a tragic reminder that violence motivated by ideological extremism is an enduring threat to our security at home and abroad. We've seen that ISIL and other groups have been able to successfully recruit and inspire adherents through the internet. And recently I read an Associated Press investigation into CENTCOM's program to counter ISIL's online propaganda. The investigation found that specialists hired to work on counter-propaganda efforts had little prior experience and did not have sufficient Arabic language skills or an adequate understanding of Islam to be effective against ISIL's online recruitment efforts. What's your assessment of our cultural and linguistic capabilities, and how do we ensure that the resources that we invest in efforts to counter online propaganda are effective?
You know, first of all, it is striking to me that in a nation of 320 million people with as many immigrants that we have problems in recruiting people with appropriate language skills to run programs like this. And I find it difficult to believe is that we don't have those resources. So I think there may be bureaucratic things that prevent us from utilizing these people. In fact, if you take something, and I'll trespass in Ambassador Sheehan's territory, if you take something like the NYPD probably had language capabilities in Arabic that rivaled those of the federal government. That reflected the diverse population of New York, but it also reflected a determination to utilize those resources in a very, very effective way. That's one city. We have a lot of cities with a lot of communities where they speak a lot of different languages, and so this is something. It's not a resource problem. It is how we are putting this together. Now, I don't know that everyone that's in one of these programs has to necessarily be cleared to a top secret clearance and go through all of these things, which we have a tendency to do. But I would look for myself, and I don't know the details of this program, although I read the same article. I would look for what are the bureaucratic obstacles, the organizational obstacles to getting qualified people into this, as opposed to, gee, we can't find enough Arabic speakers in the United States.
Mr. Jenkins has his right, Congresswoman. The NYPD program had no security classifications for most of its Arabic speakers, Urdu speakers, Farsi speakers, et cetera. They didn't need it. What they did was they created enough to put those people operationally in a box so that they did not have access to classified information, so that they were never a threat to the security of NYPD or the city or any of the FBI's programs. So we were able to use the linguists that we had within NYPD to do all kinds of things, not only on the internet. We were able to establish chat rooms far faster than the federal government was able to do after 9/11, because quite frankly, the FBI and the CIA have a very long and in-depth process of making people have top secret, highly classified qualifications in order for them to operate in some of these programs. When I've long believed that you could put those people, and to include undercovers and other folks, you box them off from your secure programs and they're able to operate. And I think that we should, other jurisdictions can look to the NYPD model and duplicate those on a much smaller scale. But of course, they have much smaller cities as well. So I think there are ways that they can get into the communities, get into the chat rooms, get into the internet, and help find those problems. One other issue on Tampa, San Bernardino, Boston, and others. One of the things that's happened in those cases is the FBI, when it opens up a case on an individual, it will follow them for a long time, but after if that person isn't really active, they're going to drop the case. And normally, the local jurisdiction is not notified about that unless they have an officer within the JTTF. I would advocate, like NYPD does, if a case is dropped, like the two brothers in Boston, the local police should have picked that up. And they won't conduct that operation exactly like the FBI will. They may go knock on the door of the house or the neighbor, but at least they'll know that people are looking at them that might deter them from acting. Those are things that could be done tomorrow in other jurisdictions that I believe can be a great deterrent to some of these homegrown folks with a little bit of creativity with the local law enforcement. And by the way, I've been down to Broward County, talking to JTF down there and some of the police forces. More can be done.
Thank you.
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for really the entire hearing schedule we've had in this committee all of the material seems to build on what we've learned in our prior discussions, and it seems to be drawing into very sharp relief the need to enhance our readiness to deal with these very complex challenges. Ambassador, you testified earlier that one of the things we could do to be most effective in counterterrorism is to support those who have more inclusive values at the local level, perhaps even at the tribal and community level in some of these places of concern. Yet in Mr. Jenkins' testimony, we seem to have the identification of at least 5 functional failed states in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and Libya. And so in these failed states, what are the effective tools in the toolbox that we can use to support, generate, facilitate some of the civic institutions that can be the most effective counterterrorism tools?
Thank you, sir. I think even in failed states, we can work with local militia forces to fight the terrorist militia forces. And we are trying to do that at varying degrees and varying levels in places like Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. I think we can step up that activity because really it is a local fight. And I think if I can share this with you in Yemen, I think in Yemen we put too many resources in their traditional military structures, some of which had very dubious allegiances to the government that we supported, and that came back to bite us. If you really look at who was actually fighting AQAP in the mountainsides of central Yemen, it was some of these tribal groups that were actually first organized by the Soviet Union back in the 70s in the Civil War there. But basically what they were tribal organizations like in Afghanistan, like our ALP program, the local police, where it goes back to the Vietnam models and the 60s models about organizing local militia to defend their villages. And sometimes in failed states, that's where you have to start to work. At the local level, working with people that are willing to fight for their side and work with them as opposed to perhaps trying to stop from the top in where a government is either broken or full.
And Ambassador, there's increasing concern in Congress that our work with those local militias can lead to perhaps a lack of fidelity with them to our values and to our objectives in the region. What are the things that can be done to ensure that if we engage some of these local militia forces, our warfighters don't end up fighting against our own material?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. The first time I ever trained and armed a local militia, a month later the guerrillas came and shot a few of them and took away 40 weapons. So it's a risky proposition.
Is it only case by case that we can determine where there's this loyalty, or are there some best practices we've used in other parts of the world, South America, other places that we could use in the Middle East?
There are plenty of best practices dating back decades. But ultimately what you have to do is decentralize your decision making and allow the operators on the ground to make decisions about who actually they're going to spend resources to train, advise, and assist. What are the units, whether it be militia or certain of the government units, which are the ones that are really actually willing to fight, and put your resources there. And there's no, I don't think, a cookie cutter solution. I think it has to be determined at the local level.
Are you confident that within our current force structure and chain of command that there's sufficient devolution on those questions?
I think that we have some really smart folks out there working these issues. I do believe, and I alluded to this in my testimony, that we're fairly thin in some countries that are very problematic. Although we are increasing fairly dramatically in Africa, the size of our forces, the 3rd and 10th Special Forces Group over there. I think that we need to establish a more robust presence in some of these smaller countries. And I'm talking, again, in dozens or 50, hundreds of people, not thousands, and they have to stay there for a while, at least on repeat assignments. And we were talking about this in the ante room, about creating cadres that can develop real expertise in the region, so that they can know the language, know the people, know which units to support. I'm not sure our Army has the proper management systems in place to develop, train, deploy, and nurture those types of folks and their careers in those faraway places that were really is at the tip of the spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is it Swazi? All right, thank you. It'll take me a while to get it right. Welcome the gentleman to the committee. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for keeping the hearing open. I think we're some of the last ones here, so thank you for sticking around for the whole time. I appreciate it very much. And thank you to each of the speakers for a fantastic education that you gave us all today. I'm going to follow up on something that Mr. Gates was starting to probe there. And Ambassador, you were talking about, or maybe it was Mr. Jenkins, you were talking about failed states and ungoverned areas. And, you know, not so much about the ideology, just this concept of, that Tom Friedman has used in his book recently, of control versus chaos. The idea of, you know, places that are stable in the world versus places that are becoming chaotic because of climate change, because of civil war, because of corruption, because of incompetence. There's really a battle in the world of control versus chaos. And I want you to suggest to us where we need to prioritize which places that are failed or are ungoverned that we should be focusing on trying to get them more stabilized, and where should we be concerned are the next places that could become failed states, or, as you said before, you know, armies, you know, armies that have gone out of control because they were an army in place, and now, so what places should we prioritize that we need to, you know, you talked about these small states in sub-Saharan Africa. Where should we be focusing on trying to stabilize existing places that are unstable, and where are the places that we have to worry are going to fall next? And I'll ask you first, Ambassador.
Well, thank you. I ticked them off in my testimony there, and I think that in the failed states, the four that I mentioned, in Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and Libya, we have to put a high priority of activity in also those four countries.
Which has the best opportunity of getting stabilized of those four?
Oh, I don't think any of them have very good prospects at all for years. I was in Somalia in 1994, so how many years ago is that? And it was a mess then, and it still is now. And Yemen is a disaster, as is Libya. These are going to be broken states for a long time, and even when you do get governments that are stable, the countryside is going to be out of control for decades. So I think in those four countries, we have to put a major effort. In Yemen, you have AQAP, which has demonstrated in the past its ability. In Libya, I'm very concerned about it. Professor Hoffman talked about Somalia and its challenges. And Syria is obviously.
So there's no argument you would prioritize one over the
four.
other? Okay. So, like, for example, I was speaking to some Europeans the other day. They're most concerned about Libya because that's
it's close.
It's closest one. So should we prioritize that first before going to others? Or
Look, right now our priority is in Afghanistan if you look at the force levels. And in Iraq, of course, because we're trying to roll ISIS out of Mosul and then eventually kick them out of Raqqa. And I think and then we're going to have a pretty substantial forces in both of those places. However, I would say some of these others are just as problematic.
Any place you're worried, the next place that could fall that it's not on the list now, but it's the next place that could go?
I would worry about the Central African areas, like the parts of Nigeria. Nigerian state is not going to fall, but is of the country that could come out of control, and that would be very problematic. But I think North Africa is probably, because of its proximity to Europe, and once you're in Europe, it's easy to get to the U.S., is really somewhere I would focus on.
I only have a minute and 10
Jordan,
seconds left.
By the way, I'll throw in there.
Mr. Jenkins?
You know, the patterns have been pretty stable in terms of the real hardcore areas, and even before we get to anticipating which ones we should be anticipating, we have a long enough list of ones that are on the critical list already.
Now, right, yeah.
That we don't necessarily have the resources to be ambitious, although it would be nice to anticipate all of these things. So I would certainly share with the focus being on these. I think the real issue is that when we pay attention to one of these, we have to be realistic about what we can do with our resources, and therefore are going to have to rely more on Arab allies that can field forces and on dealing with local militias, and not necessarily taking the course that the prerequisite has to be we have to restore a functioning central government, which gets us into the nation-building business, before we take these measures. So we may end up working with local irregular forces before there is anything called a government or looks like a government. And we may end up leaning on some of our Arab state allies who have expressed a willingness to do some of these things and saying, yes, you can put some people on the ground there more easily than we can, because we don't have enough expertise and forces, and also we're Americans here, to deal with all of these. So it doesn't mean not engagement, but it means a very effective management. It does mean getting into the very ambitious task, as I think we have in Afghanistan, of well, first we're going to have a big Afghan government, and we're going to have an Afghan national army, and we're saying, well, good luck, that's 2-3 generations away.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, could I add very quickly? I'll answer your questions in reverse order. For me, my biggest concern is Yemen, because I think Yemen is going to split into two, and we're going to have a Houthi, Shia-based country influenced by Iran with now a significant Iranian foothold on the western part of the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. And then we're going to have a Salafi jihadi state or statelet on the eastern side. And that's going to, I think, have profound geopolitical and strategic repercussions up the Arabian Peninsula. And Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states must be very concerned about that. Very briefly, I think the bigger question is that the simplest answer is, where are our interests most important and where are the best local allies to work with? And when those two things converge, I think that gives us an indication where the greatest benefit of our attention and efforts might be. But in one sentence, I think the biggest problem is that in some of these regions, the World War II borders are being reshaped, whether we or anybody else likes it. And going in and sort of buttressing borders that have outlived their relevance is going to be a fool's errand. So we have to think in this upheaval that has become very localized, where we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, where we can't turn back the clock, where, again, between the confluence of our interests and local allies, is that combination best served? So just for example, I'm not advocating this, but with the Kurds in Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, I mean, that's where you have something of this convergence. So it may be thinking less in stereotypical nation-state terms and more in the new constellations of local power that are going to emerge.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least on this topic, gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our panel for your testimony today. It's been an interesting discussion. I know that we've had several questions on counter-messaging this morning, and I know that some of the witnesses have stated that we're doing okay on the narrative, for example, how we're doing dealing with refugees, but it's not going to convince people to change their ideology. So I believe it was Mr. Hoffman that indicated that we should do more to disable cyber capabilities. So on that topic, I'd like to explore that a little more, and what can we do? What more can we do on the cyber front?
It may be akin to our leadership attrition strategy that we use now, where that it doesn't provide necessarily an ultimate answer or deliver the crushing blow that I talk about, but it keeps our adversaries sufficiently off balance and disrupts their message to an extent that it has just much greater difficulty reaching their intended audiences. I mean, this is an ongoing problem because, of course, as technology improves, what we've seen is that terrorists are able often to seize on that technology faster than governments can adjust to it. So that's one of the challenges. But, I mean, in my testimony, I described 40,000 fighters from more than 100 different countries. What common message could we possibly direct that is going to push back on whatever individualistic or idiosyncratic reason they've been recruited? I mean, that's why I think that it's important to do these things, but we can't see it as an end in itself. And that relying on what we're really good at, we're not good at counter-messaging. We were during the Cold War. We had the United States Information Service and Information Agency to do it, but that's in the past. What we're good at now is utilizing technology and harnessing technological disruption, I think would be a much in terms of cost-effective and beneficial, would be an improvement over what we're doing now.
Anybody else want to offer anything else? No? Okay. So one of you, in relation to a question that Mr. Fadek had with respect to, the answer was to working more closely with the countries in the region in the Middle East. Could you expand on that in exactly what way are you suggesting we work more closely? Mr. Jenkins, was that you, I think?
Yes. I mean, first of all, we can do more with regard to just military operations, and this is not a matter of attempting to create, you know, the anti-jihadist equivalent of NATO or something like that. We're not at that formal level, but we certainly can try to more effectively enlist and assist these local states that do have resources, and I'm talking about both military resources as well as political and propaganda resources to make that work. Now, again, we have to be realistic. They're not necessarily going to get great report cards on every aspect of something we would look for in a NATO ally. But we're going to have to be able to do that simply because we are the inappropriate inappropriate instrument. We are the instrument of last resort in these things. We cannot be the lead instrument in every one of these. Second, in terms of our expectations of these, in some cases they don't have to be good enough to match the American armed forces. They have to be good enough to deal with Al-Qaeda or to deal with whatever the local branches of ISIL or other jihadist groups. In some cases, we may be recruiting locally for militias for the sole purpose of out-recruiting the other side. In other words, not even thinking about them as a fighting force, where simply we have unemployed young men, and if we don't do something, they'll end up fighting for the other side because they'll pay them. And in that sense, it's a lot cheaper to say, okay, there'll be an armed militia, and we can have them do something useful. But at the very least, it's far more costly and dangerous to take them out when they join ISIL. And ISIL is an example. Not every Syrian in the ranks of ISIL is a dedicated, hardcore jihadist. There are a lot of them that have joined us because there were no other options. So for survival, for economic survival, we did this. So we can look for opportunities to do that. In other words, we're moving away from, I think if there's a common message one common message we're sending here is, one, it's a long time. We can't shorten that. Two, we have to be careful about the kind of things we do because they can be costly and counterproductive. Three, this is not a war in a sense it's not like we're going to land on the beaches of Normandy, liberate France, and cross the Rhine and head for Berlin. This is going to be much more in the realm of managing. It's closer to dealing with a law enforcement problem in a certain sense with military force than it is waging a war, although military force is going to be used. And therefore, we're going to be lowering expectations in some cases, going for the long run, not doing counterproductive things, managing costs, making careful judgments. That's conceptually so different from the traditional way we have looked at warfare and military operations. I don't want to use the wrong term, but that is paradigm changing. That's a conceptual change. And our military institutions, as splendid as they are, that's a difficult change for them to do, and maybe they're not even the right instrument. Maybe we create a number of ad hoc things that realize, look, this is not what you guys do best, and we have to figure out other ways of getting this done, and we're going to use some military assets, but it's going to be a very different way of conducting operations.
Thank you. Thank you. I know my time's expired. You know, I would be interested in knowing if you could respond for the record in your assessment, if it's a way that you can quantify it, to the degree to which the fighters involved in this are doing it because of ideology, and which are doing it because there were no other options, which is the bigger two. And I have some other questions that I'd like to submit for the record, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back.
Thank the gentleman. I think that's very interesting. Lots of interesting conversations. The last one was particularly interesting to me. We face a similar kind of situation when we look at the hybrid threat that Russia poses. It's not strictly tanks coming across the plains of northern Europe. It's much subtle. Do we have the right military or other instruments of national power to deal with that? Not just the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, as you talked about Hezbollah a while ago. And terrorism has some elements of that, where just our traditional notions of military power may not be the right way to deal with it. We'll have a lot more conversation about that, but a lot of that is the job of Congress to make the reforms sometimes that the military has a hard time doing itself. But to do that in a prudent way, that's why we're particularly grateful to have y'all's guidance in thinking about these issues, and we'll continue to rely on you in the future. Thank you all again for being here. The hearing stands adjourned.